Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Pro AV Today. I am your host, Ben Thomas. Today's conversation is one I've been looking forward to having for a long time, and it intersects really two of my biggest passions in life, which is professional AV and marketing in the B2B side of the world and wrestling, which sounds like a weird mix and combination, but I promise there's a lot more in common than you think. So I wanted to bring on some folks who could help break it down, not only from a wrestling standpoint of understanding things like personal branding and how folks have leveraged content to help elevate the personal brands and the larger brand as a whole, but also how we could pull some of those principles into our world as a B2B and Pro AV community. So my guests for today are Chris Neto, Jimmy Vaughan, and Dan Vollmayer. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming on the show today, and I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Ben, for having us.
Said this is going to be fun.
Yeah, no, it's a little weird, and I've got to be honest about it. I don't know that a lot of folks really know where to even begin where this conversation starts. So we'll start with this, right? Our audiences are pretty familiar with the both of you, but talk about how you got into wrestling, right? Was it younger, Jimmy? You've got a heck of a story too, Chris. I know that we chat still offline all the time about it. Chris, kick us off. How'd you get into wrestling for the first time?
So let me be straight here. I was never a wrestler. I have no association. I'm just a fanboy. Like, this was what you did on Saturday mornings, right? Or Sunday mornings back in the 80s. You watched Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik at my age. That was the thing. You didn't have any pay-per-views. It was just wrestling, right? You grew up with the Bret the Hitman Harts and the Shawn Michaels and that whole thing. And if you were lucky, you stayed up to watch Saturday Night Main Event and somebody got kicked in the head and hit with a coconut and stuff like that. So I go back to old school. And there was a period where I did not watch because I kind of grew up and it was not a thing that was on TV a lot. So when I got to college, it became a Thursday, Friday kind of thing or specifically the Monday night. So Monday night was the Monday Night Wars. A friend of mine who came out of same high school as me kind of said, hey, man, I don't go anywhere until I watch wrestling. Or wherever we do, we watch wrestling. So we started just hanging out. And then all of a sudden, the stories started to make sense, right? And this is where I got hooked because I stopped seeing it as two dudes just, bashing. It wasn't about the fight. I started looking at it as choreography, and I started looking at it as a show and stories. If you were hooked into the story, like if you were following the Stone Cold Steve Austin story, or if you saw Rocky back in the day as Rocky Maivia and his story,
oh yeah,
Jimmy has back in the day, like to his journey from going to being the island guy to becoming The Rock and the professional, actor that you see today. You watch that and you watch an evolution of it. And to me, that was the cool part, is that somebody was behind the scenes writing the stories, hey, we're going to do this because if you smash into their car in the back parking lot, they go away. That covers up that they had an accident outside the rink. Maybe they twisted their ankle and needed a couple weeks to recoup. So, and then they come back and they're mad and they got an edge to them, right? And that edge is going to lead to a story that's going to carry on all the way for the next couple months, and then they're going to fight at WrestleMania. That, to me, that storytelling and that branding stuff all comes into my everyday work because it's kind of like it's sales minded, and it gives me direction on guerrilla marketing, on social, and everything I do, because I take the time to kind of take what, and Jimmy will get to his part of this story. Like, I take those ideas and the shock values of them and how they worked with the audience and understanding the audience and building that. It kind of made sense. They're a massive marketing machine, and it was all based around storytelling. The better the storytelling, the more hooked the people got into it. So, and that's very relevant in today's world, especially when you're talking about SEO and content creation. If you don't have that story, that engaging story, you're kind of you're kind of out of it.
Well, that's exactly right, and that's very similar to my story, right? Growing up, being a fan of just the theatrics and the pyro, and the guys beating each other up, and kind of flipping into that creative side, which is where Jimmy actually has had a chance to work previously. I don't want to, I don't want to give away too much, Jimmy. I mean, Chris kind of gave away your rock story there, but well, have you started off? I mean, what got you interested in it, and then how did that transition into a career?
Yeah, I was not interested. I'm still not interested in it. It's one
Great.
of those things.
Perfect
that
guess.
sort of, but I think that sort of helps what we're going to be talking about here today and everything. But I was a TV guy, and I was working for Inside Edition and Geraldo and MTV and Current Affair back in the 90s in New York City. And I was given an opportunity to go to an interview, and I went to the interview for a company called Titan Sports. I didn't know what they were. I had no idea, but I sat in the lobby and there was a poster of The Undertaker. And I was not a fan of wrestling growing up. I'm still not a big fan of the classic wrestling things and everything else. But I interviewed, got the job, went through a whole bunch of stuff and sort of learned to appreciate what's there. And Ben, you said we're here to talk about how AV and wrestling can sort of be correlated. Everything in the world can be attributed to wrestling somehow or another. We could go down so many different paths, but the truth is, when I was there, I mean, I entered a world that, like you were talking about, Chris, the 80s, where Hulk, eat your vitamins, all the different things that were very, very corny to me. And a lot of us there were sort of on the page of, we need to do something a little bit different. And to your point, Chris, it was storytelling. It was 100% storytelling. I started to learn a little bit, even just starting to go there. A lot of the wrestlers really take offense when you use the term wrestling's fake, because really it's not fake. We actually, one of the first projects that I worked on when I was there was a video series. And it was old stylized video that we shot on film. We were shooting on film back then. We shot on film and we did film to tape transfers. But it was a promotion that actually started with 6'10". I'm 390 pounds. I've broken every bone in my body. I broke my neck, I broke my back, and then Stone Cold comes, but I still got up. And that's what these guys do. They are so precise in what they do. They are the best athletes that you will ever see in your life. And the truth is they bash their bodies to a point that I don't think anybody should be doing, but at the same point, they do it for the love of the sport and the love of the game. And the truth is, it's not fake, it's predetermined. And that's a key that really has to do it. And to your point, Chris, storytelling was everything. As you go back to the era that I helped to sort of bring in back in the day, and by no means was I one of the influential ones. I give credit to everybody.
He's talking about the Attitude Era. Which for those of us in wrestling, it's like the Monday Night Wars. And for those non-wrestling folk, it was basically what made Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and The Undertaker to a large extent popular. So give yourself some credit, Jimmy.
It was what 28-year-old Jimmy wanted to see on TV. That's really what that was about, was we've got to get out of this stuff, but we've got to tell compelling stories, and we've got to have people that want to come back and do things. And to the credit of all the wrestlers, I mean, they're their own brand, and they go out and, I know we're going to be talking about marketing, but the truth is you need a story. Einstein once said of anything, if you can't explain this to a 6-year-old, it's likely that you don't understand it yourself. And that's the way that you really tell stories. I watch the South Park guys who do great job of telling stories. And they say, you should never write something that says, this happens, then this happens, then this happens. It's always because, or therefore, or all of these things. So they'll put ideas on a whiteboard and then they'll go, therefore this happens, therefore this happens. And they base things. And what you see even in movies and things like that is a lot of storytellers don't follow basic storytelling ideas. And it's as old as time. And if you take it back to even wrestling, that's what we were doing back in the day. And I don't know that they do the same thing now. When I try to watch, I'm going away because the storytelling just is not what I think I appreciate and what I wanted to see. So it's been one of those things that's challenging, but yes, I'm in a completely different industry. I don't do wrestling anymore. I didn't really want to do wrestling, but it was something, and it was an unbelievable experience because the truth is, it was like a rocket ship. We went from nothing to the biggest thing in the world with guys like Stone Cold, The Rock, and common names that everybody knows nowadays, because it became a worldwide phenomenon.
And Dan, I want to kick it over to you. Same question, obviously, as somebody who grew up as a fan of wrestling, had a chance to do a whole lot of things in the entertainment industry and content industry. Tell us a little bit about your story and how you got into wrestling specifically.
Hey, Ben, thanks for having me. I'm a producer, director, comedy writer. I guess nowadays you just call that a content creator, working in television and social media. I've spent the last 15 years really zeroing in on work in the field of sports, worked with Barstool Sports and Nickelodeon Sports, done a lot of projects with the NBA, NFL, NHL, PGA. I guess everybody really, NASCAR. But along my journey, I spent time working at WWE and AEW, specifically with WWE. I was an on-air host. I don't know how they let me talk about wrestling on air, but they did, and it was such a blast. I really, really loved it. And as far as how I got into wrestling, I remember it well. I was about 8 years old at my friend's house, and we snuck up into his parents' attic and found a big box of magazines. And it's not what you think. They're not, it wasn't dirty magazines. It was actually professional wrestling magazines. And I just remember going through all the magazines and reading all the articles and looking at all the pictures. And I was just like, this is amazing. I need to learn more about this stuff. And started watching television, Saturday mornings like we all did. And that continued on into high school and around college. Most normal adults give up on wrestling, but no, not me. I did not give up on wrestling. I stayed with it, and I'm thankful that I did, because that gave me the opportunity to work for WWE, as I said, as a host on WWE's The Bump.
Well, you bring up a good point, Jimmy, and Chris. I think this is where you mentioned kind of that creativity, that storytelling in those different audiences. When you look at the AV world, probably the last 10-ish years, the way that folks have tried to reach their audiences looks a little different, right? When you think of Infocoms, the NABs, the ISCs of the world, whatever, 10, 15 years ago, very suit and tie, very formal, very everything's handshake. And there was a lot of, folks who were, I don't want to say not creative minded, but we're, very specific type of audience. And, from that perspective too, what are some of the ways that from a creative standpoint and from an audience development standpoint, you've seen our AV community evolve, especially when it comes to, wanting things like more content, wanting to have more affiliation with a brand, things like that?
Well, I think what you're starting to finally see and is brands starting to accept that social media is not going away. Right. I've been doing social media for 10 years. Right. You can look at social media as your marketing. If you want to say I'm all in on social media, that's my marketing plan. There are others that still want to go through their traditional, hey, here's a press release. We're going to do this. We're going to have a launch and go through the process. And then maybe they'll send it out on social. And then there's the people that are actually taking the both and kind of marrying them together, because a press release is only as good as the 15 minutes that it releases. Right. So how do you continue that conversation, right? So you can now take, if you create product X, and well, that's a bad example considering that some folks now may be trademarking that, but you take product XYZ and you take that and you say, hey, this is coming out on Tuesday. And now you link that to the content. The content, I think, is where all these, this conversation is really going to go. Because before it was, here's a box and here's my coffee cup and this is the coffee cup. See it. It's $5.99 on sale starting Monday. That was it. Now the coffee cup is taking a journey, because me and what I do, I'll take that coffee cup the day it comes out and I start showing that, this coffee cup was in London, right? I had coffee cup with me in Madrid. I have the same coffee cup with me back in Jersey at the shore, buried in the sand. You're now invested in the journey of where this coffee cup is going. And guess what? It's helping you connect. I need that cup, right? Now, that's obviously a very simple way to do it. But I think with the rise of influencers in our space, you have an additional now, the seriousness behind social. Every brand now has its own podcast, right? And it was originally just an audio thing because nobody wanted to play with video. But now you're starting to associate brands and faces and people and places and things together. I think that it's now really starting to become it's more that term engagement, right? It's that engagement. It's also that what's the word that I'm not a marketing folk, so I don't say it very well, but maybe it's the activation is the term that the marketers like to use. to talk about, how you bring in all these things and collide into it, right? I think that's where I think that's ultimately where it's going, Ben. I mean, that's what I see the big differences is where this from an AV marketing and product specific thing, you can't just release an amplifier anymore. That amplifier has to come with a deeper story. Why? Because you want to connect to the people who now know that they want it. Because you know what? It's not just about it being 500 watts. It's 1,000 watts. It's got every connector in the back. And this company, XYZ, figured out this, which I've been asking for years. Next thing you know, you are vested in it. It will lead us down a very weird conversation about like the cultish behavior of people that want to buy from a particular brand, which also ties back into it. And I'm sure we'll go into the conversations of how wrestlers sell T-shirts. Now they are their own brand. But there are diehard brand aficionados within our industry who've only bought simply because they know the brand and don't care what the product is. Now you're starting to see, I want this specific thing because they do it well. And they'll buy widget X from company X because that saved their butt on a Monday night install in New York City at 11. That was the only thing that they could get, and it worked. So now they're sold. And then once you hook them, they're going to be your biggest proponent and your biggest voices and your biggest cheerleaders.
Well, and I think, Jimmy, there's a natural parallel there between Microsoft and what Chris is talking about, right? When you think about even the wrestling side of the world, too, there's the umbrella, which is whether it's WWE, whether it's AEW, whoever. And then there's the sub-brands, right? There's, the Monday Night Raws, there's the pay-per-views, premium live events, and then there's the individual wrestlers themselves, catchphrases, merchandise, shirts, all that. Microsoft is structured in the same way, right? Microsoft has as much brand affinity as you could probably get in the entire world. But what's happened over the years is whether it's products like Windows, whether it's, hardware, whether it's cell phones, all the way to and including Teams, there's so many different aspects, right? How do you, even pulling from the wrestling side of things where you have the individual performers and the individual brands, how do you parallel that to even the sub-brands of someone like Microsoft?
It's again in that story side. One of the reasons why you go with Microsoft is because it has so many different avenues that you can do as a business. Let's just take SharePoint, for instance. I mean, SharePoint is the basis for a lot of the technology that's actually out there right now, including Teams. You might not know that, but again, SharePoint has to be there to elevate it. And if we look at wrestling, you can't have a winner without having some guy, what you call in what you term in the business as putting you over. I watch back to the era, and I watch back to when, and this is another story that I have. I mean, so many times we would do special things for people in the arena that came out to the TV events. So after the cameras were off, there were sessions that Stone Cold, The Rock, Undertaker, Mick Foley, all the different guys would go out, and the goal was to not laugh. But they would all go out. Now, somebody had to put somebody else over. And if you see some of these wrestling things, you'll see that a guy like The Rock, even though he's losing, he will hit the mat, but he'll flip himself over the ring ropes and completely oversell. This is another term, oversell that move that happens. But again, that leads to the credibility of the other guy that's actually doing the move. You can't have one without the other. You can't have some guy that just is sort of putting half effort in inside of the ring. And that's really where Microsoft and everybody else sort of has to happen as well. Everything for that marketing team to actually execute on has to execute flawlessly, or else you're going to find that, hey, I'm not that interested in this, or I'm not that engaged with it. I mean, how many times have all of us attended a podcast or something like that where people are reading slides? People are just reading the what's on the screen and sort of talking about that. And I've heard people, phrase as, well, we can't do death by PowerPoint. We can't do death by PowerPoint. And I say, well, we have to have a PowerPoint. Well, why? Because I need something to spark that conversation and spark that interest. If you're just going to look at me speaking, that's not as engaging as if I've got a chart and I can explain to you what that chart is. Now, I shouldn't have to read to you that chart, but this is sort of where you even see inside of wrestling. You can tell guys that have memorized their scripts versus guys that actually go in, have a couple of bullet points. I mean, that's one of the great things about some of the guys that we used to work with. You could give them, this is what I want you to do, and they would come out with gold. I mean, even, do you smell what The Rock is cooking? That was an offhanded comment that was made behind, in a videotaping with Jennifer Flowers when we were in Boston. I cracked up behind, but it became something that he took and he worked with. And a lot of these marketing things, you don't know what's actually going to hit with an audience. You don't know how it's going to work. So if you're given a PowerPoint and you're just reading it, good luck to you. I don't think you're selling that pen as all the salespeople say in the world. I think you really have to understand what's there and what the end goal is, which is sort of what wrestling does. And Dan, I'm sure you can talk about it a little bit too. But at the same point, when there's an event, it's always working towards the next event. It's never working towards, all right, I just have to do this.
Exactly. Well, yeah, we'll bring Dan in here as well, and just for some context, Dan, you've had the chance to work with obviously WWE on digital shows like The Bump, but also MLB and Viacom, Nickelodeon, folks like that. So you've been able to really see firsthand some of these digital evolutions, right? And I think one of the cool things that wrestling has done, and we've touched on it a couple of times, is really produce high quality content, but content that drives an outcome, right? Whether it's subscriptions, whether it's a merchandise buy, whether it's viewership, right? What are some of the ways now that you've seen audiences shift a little bit more of their content consumption habits? Is it more towards short form? Is it more, they want to hear from an individual specifically instead of a major brand? What are some of the habits that you've seen from a branding standpoint that folks can maybe pull?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to go with that question. I mean, one thing that I see is the individual wrestlers really owning their own brand identity. Whether it's on TikTok or Twitter or YouTube, we're now following more than just the television product. We're going to that second screen, as they call it. I want to see, what Ronda Rousey has to say after her match or before her match. It's really exciting to kind of see that develop. And I think Jimmy made a great point that it really is all about driving to what's next. There never is an ending. There is no off season. Football, basketball, sure, there's an off season. In wrestling, it never ends. And that's really how marketing works as well. You're always building towards the next thing. And even when you feel comfortable with something or how something's presented or how these wrestlers are looking on social media, Vince or someone else is going to say, hey, that's great, but how can we do it better? It's never going to be good enough. And that can be frustrating and daunting, especially someone like myself who needs those pats on the back to know that they're doing a good job. But at the same rate, it's a great way to, evolve a brand and push forward.
Well, Chris, I want to bring you in on this too, right? There is a practical element of what we're talking about, and the practicality and the direct correlation a lot of times from the wrestling and the content creation side of the world and the individual branding extends to our companies by elevating engineers, elevating sales team members, elevating product designers, and giving them a voice where traditionally it was kind of under the guise of, the major brand, right? What are some of the ways that we can draw these direct correlations as a group of marketers, as in a group of sales folks or individuals inside of a company, where we can help take those core tenets of that wrestling and personal branding and help elevate it in our own community?
Well, let's first start off by talking about what you're asking. You're asking for a brand to put their trust in a person. That's hard, right? That is super hard. Now, the wrestlers themselves are their brands, right? They are owning their brands, as Dan said, right? An unknown is a hard person for somebody to put trust in, right? I've been doing the social stuff now for over 10 years, right? At this stage of my career, I'm finally getting to the point where people understand that if I'm going to do a quick video about me going to Infocom, I'm hyping something, right? I'm a hype man when it comes to this, right? Whether it's the products, whether it's my presence or my company's presence there at a trade show booth, whatever it may be. They know me for what I do on Sundays, which is my 24/7 branding exercise that never stops. That's it will happen regardless if I'm working for company X, Y, or Z, right? It's now my Sunday thing when I do AV in the AM. That is propelling me forward. The brands that I use know that, hey, this guy talks about it on Sunday. I get a lot of eyes. I get a lot of action from the fact that people watch what I do on Sundays. So when I'm going to a trade show, I work for a company now in Starin that embraces that. They're like, hey man, what did you talk about on Sunday? I'm like, oh, we talked about, audio, is 70 volts going away. and we will take that conversation and we break it down, because it's basically a focus group that essentially comes out of Sunday. And it's open to everybody to follow. If you watch and listen and follow what's going on Sunday mornings with AV and AM, it's a big town hall / focus group. So for me, going into the trade shows, I have a plan, and it doesn't align with my marketing, unfortunately, because I look at things like Dan and Jimmy were saying. I start planning out 30, 60, 90 days out. 90 days, I'm teasing that I'm going. 60 days, I announce that I'm going. 30 days, I'm there, and you're going to find me here, right? And those points are to find me on the floor. This year, I had people chasing me around for stickers and a bracelet that said, I am AV in the AM, right? And the reason why, it was the only time I was going to have it. I drew the crowd because of exclusivity. You were only going to get those if you found me on the show floor. I'm not mailing them to anybody. It sounds like it's haphazard, but that's the beauty of it. The things that Jimmy produced and that Dan are talking about, it doesn't have to be a Hollywood movie, and it doesn't have to be a Hollywood script. Right now, I'm watching how, my lessons for marketing, I'll watch the Udemy, the LinkedIn lessons, and I'll take classes, but the best information I get is on Monday nights, Tuesday nights, Friday nights, and on these events. I watch how they're presenting these vignettes, right? You know that somebody's coming because here is just a very basic video of somebody who they're not announcing who their name is. They just say coming soon. I do that with products. I do that with me going to events. I'm not saying I'm a celebrity, and I'm not saying I'm The Rock, but what I am saying is, if I give people that little bit of information and I build it out over the course of 30, 60, 90 days, there is what's going to be revealed, what's the payoff, what's at the end, right? And I've taken bumps, as Jim said, right? I've fallen for others to get up, and I will absolutely take the punch for somebody to rise up, and that we're going to highlight this person, because it's, some people call it the rub, right? Where you happen to be in the same place at the same time in the same ring with the person. Now, all of a sudden, the term is I'm giving somebody the rub, and the rub is that you're rubbing off some of your star power onto somebody else. It has nothing to do with me, but you could take the person of your company that you select to do this, right? And make them the voice of the control system, of the amplifier, of the speaker, right? And the association of it. Little things like the colors, like ring attire, the colors, the setting. Creating video to show, an install, that makes sense. You want to do a Hollywood video doing an install? Not so much, right? You're going to be covered in sheetrock. You're going to be running through tunnels and pulling wires. Like you have to build the. And I'm a former broadcast guy too, Jimmy. So I got my background in TV and broadcast, so I understand that there's a look and feel that can be accomplished technically to kind of go with the story, right? Watch movies. Some of the, you watch a movie like Seven, right? An old school movie. Let's go old school. Seven is done a certain way with a certain look and a certain edit that plays towards the subject of that. It was an actor, right? You cannot pull that movie off in a, who's the director? Wes Anderson style movie. Wes Anderson has his own style movie that would not work for what they did with the movie Seven, right? The bright colors, all this sort of stuff. So understanding the situational awareness, knowing the audience, right? And then building into this and taking the stories, what those stories may be, whether it's the new product launch and adding to it.
No, that's helpful context, Chris. And I want to come to Dan next, and then Jimmy, I'll kind of give you the last word on this. Dan, one of the things that keeps jumping out as Chris is having this conversation is the way that WWE has handled folks like Logan Paul and superstar social media influencers and people really who have embraced the digital world, right? Whether that's through YouTube, whether that's through TikTok, Twitter. What are some of the things that us as a B2B community, just from a content creation standpoint, kind of going back to what Chris was said, what are some of the things that we can embrace that has been so successful for these folks, even outside of WWE?
Well, I think we see now more than ever, social influencers have such a great pull. And it's exciting because just a few years ago, and if you wanted to have someone endorse your product, you'd have to go through a Hollywood agent. You'd have to get somebody, I mean, not have to, but you would strive to get somebody like The Rock. He wouldn't pick up the phone most likely, but instead you can get people that are able to do the work for a lot less money. I mean, I'm not talking about Logan Paul. Obviously, he's going to, ask for a pretty big, he's going to call for a pretty big bar tab. But I think that getting the rub and embracing opportunities to bring somebody in, whether that's an expert in a specific field, like, my astute colleagues here, I mean, in many ways, Ben, we're giving you the rub right now. I mean, maybe not so much me, but, the rest of the team here. I think, and it all comes down to collaboration and finding different ways to work. I mean, look, when wrestling first started, not to get into a history lesson here, hundreds of years ago, or 100 years ago, wrestling was it was a shoot, and that's an inside term for a real fight, and it was in Carney World, and promoters started to realize that this was kind of boring, and the audiences weren't really embracing it the same way. It was just two half-naked men rolling around the mat, and maybe there's some audiences out there that like that, but back then it wasn't working. People started going to see the bearded lady in the next tent. So the promoters had to come up with ways to get more people to come see them. And they decided, or the promoters demanded that, hey, no more working for ourselves, no more working in a silo. We are going to communicate and we are going to collaborate. And there was some pushback on that. It had never been done before, but almost instantly you saw a change in the business. You saw better matches. You saw more fan-friendly, exciting performances. I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever been in a real fight. I can't say that I've had the luxury of being in one, but my guess is that if I'm in a real fight, I don't have time to wave my hand in the air and see if the crowd's with me on this one, because I'm going to get decked right in the face. But that's really entertaining to see that happen. In a shoot fight situation, you're not doing that. Your fists are up here and you're ducking and weaving, and kudos to MMA for creating, what Dana White has created. But back then in the Carney days, it wasn't working. And I think that's just an example of how, as B2B marketers and in wrestling, you have to constantly be evolving and changing along with your audience. And that's something that WWE has done a great job at. I mean, in many ways, it could be the same story over and over again, but just with a fresh coat of paint. I mean, it's always about having different stories, whether it's the underdog story like Daniel Bryan or a Kofi Kingston, or watching Roman Reigns, arguably one of the greatest champions we've seen, I was going to say in the last decade, maybe ever, maybe top 5. People are tuning in to see how things are evolving. And that's something that I think started, not collaboration or evolution in general, but I think it's really neat how wrestling was able to really take that off ramp and go in a different direction. And it was a risky move, but it was a risk worth taking. And it changed the business forever. And now we can see wrestlers collaborate and have conversations. And sure, I mean, the curtain's been yanked back far enough. We all know that the guys are, having chats before the matches. But that's what's made the product so amazing, and it's what made it become the spectacle that it is today. And it's just pretty exciting to see. And, I just can't emphasize enough how that sort of collaboration and ability to listen and talk and speak with other people will lead to amazing success across the board.
Yeah, and Jimmy, I want to ask you to land the plane for us here as we kind of wind this down. But, you think about everything that's been said, right, whether it's personal branding, whether it's content creation. I think at the end of the day, the collective goal, not only of the AV community, but also the wrestling community as a whole, is to drive that revenue, right? What are some of the most practical ways that you've seen people leverage a lot of this personal branding, content creation, things like that, to actually drive revenue, sales, awareness at the end of the day?
I can narrow it down. One thing that Vince actually was so brilliant in and used to hammer into us back in the day was, in wrestling, there's a baby face and a heel, and the baby face are the good guys, the heels are the bad guys. And the truth is, when you're doing character development, even when you're talking, when you're doing things like this, it doesn't matter if you like them or hate them. If that character or that product elicits a response, I got you. I got you. And that's the key to a lot of these things is, I mean, there's a lot of people that are on social media. I can't stand them. But the truth is, I go back and I watch them and I look at them because it elicits a response. You know, there's things that happen even on TV shows that, you know, I see it all the time. I hear people say, I hate this. I hate this. I can't watch this. I can't watch this. But they're watching it. You know, so it's one of those things. You've got to understand how you're bringing people in, how you're doing this. And brands especially have to understand that, you know, lines have been blurred. You know, Dan, you were talking about the old school wrestling. It was always baby face and heels. We tried at times. I know there were writer meetings that I sat in many times. How do we make people hate Stone Cold? We just couldn't do it. We didn't know how to do it. I mean, there was a time where we actually sat in a writers meeting and we were going to play Long Island at Nassau Coliseum. And we said, how are we going to make people hate them? Well, we'll have them tear down what was then called the Titantron, and we'll have them rip it up and tear it up. And then we're like, but then how do we do the show? And we thought, oh, we can't do that. So then it's like, all right, well, we'll have them go again, you know, do something specific to Vince. And we ended up buying a Corvette and filling it with concrete and doing things. And there were little things and conversations like that. But the truth is, 90% of wrestling's history has been there's a good guy and there's a bad guy. And I don't really mind if you like me or hate me because you're going to buy my T-shirt. You're going to do this. And to be honest, and Dan, I think you back me up on this. When I speak to a lot of the wrestlers back in the day, they actually enjoyed being the heel. It was a little bit of an easier character for a lot of these guys because they could do things. To be a good guy and get a cheer, that's hard to do. But to be a bad guy and get a boo, yeah, it's something pretty easy because, you know, you insult the local sports team. You know, you do different things. You know, Mick used to always be the one that was out there and, you know, he would announce the name of the city and then pause and get a cheer. You know, there's little things that happen. But again, in an AV world, in a branding world, it doesn't matter if you like me or you hate me. If I've got your trust, you know, in an AV world, if I've got your trust, and Chris, I know that I do this all the time, and I know that other people do as well. I won't actually talk about things that, number one, I don't have experience in, or number two, that I can't sort of recommend. I don't want to talk about the bad things or the things that are out there and everything else. What I really want to do is I want to take what I represent or the company that I represent and say, here's why it's good. I see too many people, and right now as we even record this, you know, a competitor of Microsoft is out there with some challenges. I don't think that the challenges might have been what they anticipated, but they're there and they have to address them. And I don't think it's fair for a competitor to say, oh yeah, this is the thing and everything else. I think it's more like, hey, we're a solution that you might want to look at because of this, without mentioning these other people. And going through it. So it's all about how you see your branding, but it comes back to maybe faces and heels. Who are you, and how do you want your audience to actually engage with you?
When it comes to the products, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, I don't want to have a heel, a bad guy pitching my product." A heel is not necessarily a guy who's going to come with the curly mustache and a funky hat of old, right? An old time.
Those guys are great, though.
They're excellent. Bring me some vaudevillian bad guys, and we're good. But if you want to be a bad guy, all you have to do is say it in a very, as a matter of fact way, and then you become the heel presenting a product. The good guy is maybe your sales guy who's going to come in and go, now, this is how you're going to use it, or your sales engineer. Well, the very matter of fact guy gets kind of pushed off to the side, and now the people's champ comes in, and the people's champ is going to tell you, this is how you're going to do it, right? So I have a bad habit as well, where I am probably the same as the panel here. If I use wrestling terms with my team, I have to stop and say, listen, this is a shoot. I'm a mark. This is how it works. This is what I grew up with, right? This is just enjoyment. This is my knowledge. Like I said, on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, I get marketing ideas, right? I've put together groups of people that were, the Wolfpack. I've put together people that were NWO that came from the crowd. That all worked because the reality of things. Superhero movies, I'll give you a prime example, and we're going to go off topic here. A superhero movie today, if you were to say a guy came from outer space and landed, great. But before you introduced the guy who came from outer space and landed, you needed people here that were making their own suits and were very human relatable, right? Then you can introduce the guy who came from outer space. That's the way it works. You have to be relatable. And when the guy from outer space shows up, he has to have some sort of relatable characteristics to what we're familiar with. When you're doing these marketings and you're doing these activations and you're doing these branding exercises, where does that connection happen, right? You want to sell a t-shirt in the wrestling world? Is it going to come from a phrase? It's going to come from a design, or is it going to come from a color? How are you putting that together from a marketing perspective? That is where people got to stop looking at the wrestler itself is the brand, right? I will always wear a black t-shirt simply because I don't know what else to wear, and it's cheap and it's easy, and I'm always in black t-shirt to the point where I have a little Funko Pop that looks like me and walks around with me, and we're always in black. The day I don't wear a black t-shirt is the day people are like, what is going on? What's the special occasion, right? You kind of always think in that. That's how I think, right? Everything has a purpose. Everything's got a story. If we're going to introduce a new brand, let's try soft launch. Soft launch is not something that's new. It's been around. But how you bring that to the table, how you introduce that new product or new brand to the world, right? If I'm going to draw 200 people to a bar in Orlando, we're going to surprise you with a launch. And you weren't expecting it. And you're going to get the t-shirt. And you're going to hear about it because not only did we take over the bar, we also put the speaker system became the audio speaker brand that we were launching. So it goes into a bigger conversation. It's not just, here's my PDF, here's the product, here is I'm not on ads. I just sell the product. It's, I think, something that's going to become a lot more forward going for brands to start adding people. Jimmy is the face of Microsoft on LinkedIn. He does his Friday conversation. It's great. It's 10 minutes. He's got his rules. I know how Jimmy operates with this. He has a set rules. It's got to be fast. It's got to be eye-catching. It's got to be quick. And it's got to be to a point. You only have so many minutes. That's why these wrestlers don't go on their vignettes are no more than 2 minutes long. Their in-ring talk doesn't last. It's a segment. They're referred to in TV time, and it's cut up in segments based on TV time. And the guy who's going to come in and break that up is because he's already talking too much, right? So the scriptedness of it is very, very, very good information for us as marketers. You have to have that space in between. You got to let a product, you pop it, get its pop, it's cheap pop, as Mick used to do. Right. And then you let it breathe a little bit and see what the reaction is. And then boom, you hit another one. Right. It's always like you guys mentioned earlier, you do a pay-per-view. It's because you're working for the next one already. By the time you get there, it's over. By the time these guys are wrestling on Wednesday,
premium live events.
Premium live event. I'm sorry, there's no more pay-per-view anymore. I'm old, dude.
Sorry, Vince has me hooked up, and I get a zap every time I hear pay-per-view.
I used to go to like
Dan knows the in-the-ear conversation that happens with those. Yeah. Stop saying that.
Yes.
But that's my point, man. I think that I think they can all learn a good lesson from it. It's something that excites me because it's more than just here. This is what we're going to move.
But even what just happened, Chris, I mean, Dan, you just hit the nail on the head. Language matters, and how you say things matters. And yes, that was something that was ingrained into us and ingrained. If you listen to people, if you don't say the right term at the right time, yes, there's somebody in your ear that's yelling at you. You said it when somebody comes out, we used to roll our eyes when Hunter would come out because he just took so long, and it would be like, hey, I'm in the game, and I am
gonna squirt some water out of my mouth.
Water out of my mouth.
Yep.
But language matters, and you've got to know your key terms. You've got to basically get your key phrases across. You've got to know these things. And Dan, to your point that you just pointed out to Chris, yeah, if you don't use that proper language, your audience starts using different language. And Vince is very, very specific on how announcers do things, how things are phrased inside of commercials. I know when we were shooting commercials, we had to say WWF. At that point, it was WWF back then, but we had to say WWF at least 3 times in a 30-second commercial because that was the important cadence that was needed. And if it wasn't there, you go back to the drawing board. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And again, people don't realize that they're being structured like this because it's kind of what they're used to. But at the same point, yeah, you're being structured like this.
Look, I think that's a great place to kind of wrap for today. But I mean, I would say in a nutshell, the best way to put it is how can B2B and Pro AV communities learn from wrestling? It would be to really embrace personal branding and do it within guide rails and guideposts. And look, I think that's the easiest way to boil it down. I mean, it's such a fun conversation we had, and obviously, learning a lot about the industry and some of the terms and things like that. It's a fun conversation. But look, if people are listening and like, what the heck are these guys talking about? There's your takeaway, right? Let the people in your communities, let the people in your companies talk because they're the most knowledgeable people probably in the company about the product. But if you give them guide rails, give them not a script, but an outline, a guidepost, you're going to see them have success. And the ones who rise to the top are going to do more for your brand than you could ever imagine. So, gentlemen, I appreciate you coming on today. It was a heck of a conversation. I'm sure we'll find a way to have another one of these because, look, we always end up talking wrestling. But look, Chris, Dan, Jimmy, you guys are amazing. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, and thanks so much for tuning in to Pro AV today. We appreciate you tuning next time, and we'll see you then.